What if the person who brought you into this world, who you trusted with your earliest memories, was not the parent you thought they were? Imagine looking at someone you called Dad and realizing that, in private, he was always playing a role designed for the public eye, a performance perfected over decades, and one that left you feeling invisible, unheard, and ultimately abandoned. That is exactly what Nick Reiner, the son of Hollywood legend Rob Reiner, revealed in court, screaming words that sent shockwaves through the legal world and the public alike. He said, "He wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role." Think about that for a moment. A director, playing a role, not a dad. How does someone process a lifetime of seeing their parent through the lens of fame, charisma, and perfection, only to realize that behind the curtain, there was a man who could love, yes, but only on his own terms? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This story is not just about a Hollywood family tragedy. It is about the devastating collision of fame, expectation, and human frailty. Rob Reiner, celebrated for his cinematic achievements, his keen sense of storytelling, and his ability to craft moments that touch hearts across the world, is now at the center of one of the most horrifying family tragedies of the year. The world watched as his life's work became the backdrop for a nightmare in Brentwood, California, a $13.5 million estate that once symbolized comfort, security, and success. But now, that same mansion is a stage for horror, grief, and a mystery that no one can seem to fully comprehend. Nick Reiner, 32, lived in the guest house on that property, a detached life within a family home, perhaps seeking autonomy, but also a sense of safety. He is now facing charges for the murders of his parents, Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70. The incident, which unfolded on a Sunday night, has left the nation stunned, prompting endless speculation, grief, and a haunting question. How could this happen in a home that seemed to embody the pinnacle of success, safety, and familial love? What forces built up in this family, quietly, invisibly, until they could no longer be contained? Think for a moment about the statement Nick made in court. It was raw, visceral, a lifeline into the psyche of a man who had spent years living in the shadow of someone larger than life. He wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. Those words are more than an accusation. They are a revelation of a deep, gnawing pain that went unspoken for decades. To hear a child say that about their parent is one thing. To hear it shouted in a courtroom, with the world listening, is another entirely. Every syllable carries the weight of betrayal, of disappointment, of love misdirected, and perhaps weaponized by circumstance. This video will take you on a journey through the life and family of Rob Reiner. Not the public persona, but the private reality, as revealed by the man who knew him better than anyone else, his son. We will explore the upbringing of Nick, the pressures of growing up in a household overshadowed by fame, the dynamics that created tension and resentment, and the series of events that led to the devastating night in Brentwood. Along the way, we will uncover the psychological layers behind the tragedy, the courtroom moments that shocked onlookers, and the haunting legacy that fame and familial expectation can leave behind. This is a story that blends human emotion, celebrity intrigue, and tragedy into a narrative that is as heartbreaking as it is compelling. The first question we must ask ourselves is, how does one reconcile the image of a public figure with the private reality of their behavior? Rob Reiner has long been admired for his work in Hollywood, from his acting in iconic roles to directing films that have become cultural touchstones. But behind the accolades and awards, what was the man like as a father? Nick's courtroom statement paints a picture starkly different from the glamorous, larger-than-life figure the world has known. It suggests a man whose priorities may have been more aligned with his public image than with the needs of his child. And that disconnect between public persona and private reality can create invisible wounds, slowly eroding trust, love, and familial cohesion. In the early years of Nick's life, he may have witnessed a father who demanded excellence, who perhaps measured love in performance rather than in presence. Imagine growing up in a household where the art of directing, a skill honed over decades, was not just a career but a lens through which all personal interactions were filtered. Imagine trying to gain your father's attention or approval, only to discover that every interaction is rehearsed, evaluated, critiqued. In such an environment, affection can feel conditional, and safety can feel performative. These are the elements that Nick's words in court hint at. The idea that he was never truly seen as a son, but rather as a character in a story his father was telling. And yet, this tragedy is not just about neglect or emotional abuse. It is about a climax of unresolved tensions, a night in which everything escalated to a point from which there was no return. The murder of Rob and Michelle Reiner is an event so shocking, so horrifying in its implications, that it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human behavior. What drives someone to commit acts that shatter lives? How do family secrets, suppressed emotions, and unmet expectations coalesce into a catastrophe? And perhaps most chillingly, what does it take for a son to view his father not as a nurturer, but as a performer in a lifelong role? The world may never know the complete truth, but there are fragments, moments, statements, evidence, and eyewitness accounts that allow us to reconstruct the story, to piece together the psychological and emotional landscape of this family. In this video, we will examine those fragments in detail. We will look at Nick's upbringing, his relationship with both parents, and the dynamics within the household that may have contributed to the tragic events. We will also explore the day of the murders, the arrest, and the courtroom revelations that have since captivated the nation. Along the way, we will ask questions, pose hypotheses, and confront the complex interplay between fame, expectation, and the human need for love and validation. Now, think about the mansion in Brentwood. A sprawling estate, valued at $13.5 million, with manicured lawns, high security, and an aura of comfort and prestige. It is a place where one would expect peace and protection. Yet within those walls, tensions festered unseen. Nick lived in the guest house, perhaps seeking a buffer from his parents, yet still tethered to the larger family unit in ways that could not be escaped. On that fateful night, everything changed. The physical space of the home, the very walls that symbolized safety, became a stage for tragedy. And the irony is almost unbearable. A home designed to project success and security became a monument to the very opposite: chaos, fear, and death. And here lies the heart of the story, the juxtaposition of public image and private reality. Rob Reiner, beloved in Hollywood, revered for his work, yet perhaps distant, exacting, or emotionally unavailable at home. Nick, a son seeking validation and love, yet met with performance, expectation, and in some moments, what can only be described as emotional absence. The tension between these two realities, the conflict between perception and truth, is what makes this story resonate far beyond the confines of a celebrity scandal. It is a universal story, though amplified by fame. The longing for authentic connection, the pain of unmet expectations, and the tragic consequences that can emerge when human emotions are ignored or misunderstood. As we move forward, we will delve into each facet of this family saga with meticulous detail. We will reconstruct Nick's childhood experiences, his teenage years, and the pivotal moments that shaped his perspective on his father. We will examine the signs of tension and unrest that may have been invisible to outsiders, yet clear to those within the family. And when we reach the courtroom, we will explore Nick's emotional outburst, dissecting every word, tone, and implication, because in those moments, the hidden truths of this family were laid bare for all to see. But even as we recount these events, one question will linger in your mind. How does a family reach a point where a son faces his parents in such a violent, irreversible confrontation? What unseen forces, what buried resentments, could drive a young man to such extremes? And as we explore this story, you may find yourself asking uncomfortable questions about your own perceptions of family, love, and expectation. Because ultimately, this is a story not just about Hollywood, not just about fame, not just about tragedy, but about the human heart, its vulnerabilities, and the devastating consequences when those vulnerabilities collide with circumstance and suppressed emotion. And now, as we stand on the threshold of this story, one thing is clear: what Nick revealed in that courtroom was only the beginning. There are layers upon layers to uncover, truths that will shock you, moments that will make you question what you thought you knew about family, and a series of events so tragic and complex that they defy easy understanding. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine a young boy walking onto a movie set for the first time. The cameras flash, the lights glare, and the entire crew moves around with the precision of a well-oiled machine. To any observer, this is the dream, an insider's glimpse into the magic of Hollywood. But for that boy, it is also confusing, overwhelming, and oddly isolating. That boy is Nick Reiner, the son of Rob Reiner, one of Hollywood's most respected figures, and Michelle Reiner, a woman of grace, intellect, and formidable presence. From the outside looking in, the Reiner family epitomized success, fame, wealth, influence. But behind the glamour lay a legacy far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Rob Reiner's career reads like a Hollywood dream. From his breakout role as the awkward yet lovable Michael Stivic on All in the Family, to directing films that have become cultural touchstones like When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, and The Princess Bride, Reiner has left an indelible mark on American cinema. He was a storyteller, a director who understood pacing, character, and emotion. Someone who could move audiences to laughter, tears, and reflection. His accolades, from Golden Globes to Academy Awards, were a testament to his talent and influence. He was a man who commanded attention both on screen and off. But for those within his home, the story was far more nuanced. Being a Reiner child meant living under the shadow of greatness. Imagine growing up in a household where every word, every action, every choice is measured against an invisible standard set by your father's towering reputation. It is not merely the pressure to succeed. It is the pressure to exist in a way that validates someone else's image, someone else's story. The walls of the Reiner estate were not just walls. They were a stage, a constant reminder that performance was expected, that perfection was not optional. And in this environment, Nick learned lessons about love, validation, and identity that were often confusing, sometimes painful, and ultimately defining. Consider what it means to be the child of a man whose profession is to observe, interpret, and direct human behavior. Rob Reiner's life was dedicated to understanding people, crafting their stories, and shaping how they were perceived. But how does a child feel when the very man who understands so much about emotion and human interaction seems unable, or unwilling, to direct that understanding toward his own family? How does a child reconcile admiration for a father's genius with the loneliness of feeling unseen? These are questions that have haunted Nick Reiner and are central to understanding the tragic events that would later unfold. Publicly, Rob Reiner was the embodiment of charm, intellect, and creativity. He was invited to the highest echelons of Hollywood society, sought after for commentary, and celebrated for his insights on politics, culture, and art. Yet fame has a way of distorting reality, creating a dual existence, one for the public and one for the private. While the world saw accolades, and charisma, the private world of the Reiners was layered with tension, expectation, and a subtle but constant negotiation of power and control. It is in this private world, behind closed doors, that Nick's story begins, an unseen narrative of longing, frustration, and a deep yearning for authentic connection. Michelle Reiner, while less publicly visible, was no less a figure of significance in this family drama. A woman of intelligence and poise, she maintained the household, managed public perception, and undoubtedly influenced Nick's upbringing in profound ways. Yet, like Rob, she was part of a household that operated on the currency of image, expectation, and performance. It is crucial to understand that neither parent was necessarily villainous in a traditional sense. Rather, the environment they cultivated, intentionally or otherwise, was one where emotional needs could be overlooked in favor of appearances, where love was sometimes conditional, and where a child's emotional reality could be rendered invisible against the backdrop of fame and public scrutiny. The dichotomy between public admiration and private strain is a story as old as Hollywood itself, but the Reiner situation was uniquely intense. To live in proximity to brilliance is to constantly compare oneself to it. To be a child in such an environment is to struggle with feelings of inadequacy, even when love is present in some form. Nick Reiner grew up observing his father command attention, elicit admiration, and masterfully direct not only films but the perception of himself and others. For a child, this is both inspiring and terrifying. It sets an impossible standard. Not just to be loved, but to perform in a way that earns that love, to exist in harmony with a narrative over which you have little control. Nick's experiences were further complicated by the unique pressures of wealth and status. The Reiner family estate in Brentwood, with its sprawling grounds, goose houses, and meticulously curated environment, was both sanctuary and cage. Living in a guest house allowed Nick a degree of independence, but it also reinforced a sense of separation. A symbolic distance between parent and child, authority and autonomy. It was a space where freedom existed, but under the constant gaze of proximity. In such an environment, minor conflicts could escalate quietly, unobserved by outsiders, yet profoundly affecting those inside. It is important to recognize the influence of legacy. Rob Reiner's achievements cast a long shadow. Every interaction, every conversation, every expectation was filtered through the lens of his accomplishments. To live in that shadow is to constantly negotiate identity. Who are you as a person if your father is larger than life? How do you assert your individuality when the world sees you primarily as an extension of someone else's success? These are the dynamics that shaped Nick's formative years and set the stage for the intense emotional revelations that would later unfold in court. The impact of this environment is compounded by the nature of Hollywood itself. Fame amplifies everything: joy, criticism, conflict, and secrecy. The Reiner family operated within a sphere where privacy was hard to maintain and scrutiny was relentless. Yet some of the most critical conflicts, the ones that shaped Nick's perception of his father, occurred far from public view. These hidden dynamics, invisible to fans and media, are key to understanding the tragedy that would occur decades later. They reveal the human cost of celebrity, the collateral damage of a life built on public admiration, and the complexity of love within a family bound by both legacy and expectation. Despite all this, Nick Reiner's childhood was not without moments of warmth, connection, and love. There were experiences that were genuine, moments where affection was authentic, and instances of bonding that reflected the humanity of his parents. But these moments were interspersed with periods of neglect, misunderstanding, and emotional distance. Periods that left scars and created a sense of longing that could never be fully satisfied. It is within this oscillation between care and absence, connection and distance, that Nick's perspective on his father began to form, a perspective that would later erupt in the courtroom in words that no one could ignore. As we explore this legacy, it becomes clear that fame and talent do not shield families from the complexities of human emotion. They may amplify them, make them more visible, or obscure them under layers of perception and expectation, but they do not eliminate the fundamental challenges of parenting, communication, and love. The Reiner story is a stark reminder that even those who achieve greatness on a public stage are subject to the same emotional struggles as everyone else, and that the consequences of unresolved tension can be catastrophic. And yet, the most striking aspect of this Hollywood legacy is not Rob Reiner's fame, nor the wealth and prestige that accompanied it. It is the profound human disconnect, the subtle fractures, and the hidden resentments that were simmering beneath the surface. These are the forces that would eventually culminate in a tragedy so shocking, so unimaginable, that it captured global attention. It is a story of brilliance and imperfection, of love and misunderstanding, and of a son who saw his father not as the nurturer he needed, but as a figure performing a role in a story that was not his own. But what happened next, as Nick Reiner's story moved from childhood into adulthood, would set the stage for revelations so dramatic that they would shock everyone who thought they knew the Reiner family. Behind the accolades, behind the laughter, behind the cinematic achievements, lay secrets, tensions, and moments of deep emotional strain. And as we turn the page to explore Nick's early life, the pressures he faced, and the dynamics that shaped him, we will begin to understand how a Hollywood legacy, for all its glamour and acclaim, can also create the conditions for heartbreak, betrayal, and tragedy. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine being a child, surrounded by privilege, comfort, and the trappings of fame, yet feeling an emptiness that no amount of wealth or attention could fill. That was the paradox of Nick Reiner's early life, a life that, from the outside, looked enviable, glittering, and perfect, yet behind the gates of the Brentwood estate was a complex tapestry of expectation, isolation, and longing. He was the son of Rob Reiner, Hollywood royalty in his own right, and Michelle Reiner, a mother whose presence commanded both respect and emotional distance. To live under their roof was to navigate a world where performance often mattered more than presence, and where affection, when it appeared, could feel conditional, measured, and fleeting. From the very beginning, Nick's environment was dominated by the rhythms of celebrity. Family dinners were not simply intimate gatherings. They were events where decorum, composure, and appearance carried weight. A wrong word, a misstep, or an unguarded emotion could feel magnified. It is easy for outsiders to assume that children of celebrities are spoiled, indulged, and shielded from ordinary struggles. Nick Reiner's story complicates that stereotype. Privilege came with its own form of pressure, the need to live up to his father's towering reputation, to navigate social and cultural expectations, and to perform emotional restraint at the precise moments the world might be watching. Every birthday party, family vacation, or casual gathering carried an undertone of scrutiny, as if the metrics of approval were invisible but omnipresent. In such an environment, a child's authentic needs and emotions can be eclipsed by the weight of expectation. Consider Nick's schooling. While some children were attending schools with their peers in relative anonymity, Nick's experiences were layered with awareness of status, attention, and public perception. Teachers, administrators, and even fellow students were aware of his father's fame. He was both admired and isolated, a living paradox. Everyone wanted to connect with him, but genuine connection was rare. Every interaction was filtered through the lens of celebrity, creating a sense of distance from peers and a subtle mistrust of relationships that were not fully authentic. In this way, Nick's formative years were shaped by both proximity to greatness and profound emotional separation. Adding to this complexity was the nature of Rob Reiner himself. On set, in public appearances, and in his career, he was a man of charisma, wit, and control. But at home, these traits, while not inherently negative, could manifest in ways that left Nick feeling unseen. Imagine growing up with a father who could command a room, direct actors, and create cinematic magic, yet struggled to translate those skills into emotional presence for his own son. Nick often witnessed a dichotomy. His father as a figure of admiration to the world, and his father as someone distant, absorbed in his own pursuits at home. This contrast between public affection and private distance left deep impressions on Nick's psyche, impressions that would later crystallize in the courtroom. Despite these challenges, Nick did experience moments of warmth and connection. There were times when his parents' affection was real and palpable, brief respites in a childhood defined by expectation. Perhaps it was a weekend at a private retreat, a shared laugh at a joke, or a rare moment when attention was given freely. But these moments were inconsistent, fleeting, and often overshadowed by the larger context of performance and public image. For a child, such oscillation between connection and emotional distance can create confusion, insecurity, and a deep-seated need for validation. Needs that are difficult to satisfy, even under the most privileged circumstances. And yet, the tension in Nick's upbringing was not simply about love or attention. It was also about identity, autonomy, and the struggle to define oneself independently of a parent's legacy. In households where a parent's fame is overwhelming, the child must constantly negotiate space. Space to be seen as an individual, space to make mistakes without repercussion, space to be human. Nick's guest house on the Brentwood estate symbolized both freedom and isolation. A place where he could carve out his own identity, yet still remain tethered to the central family unit, subject to its rules, expectations, and emotional gravity. As Nick grew older, the pressures of adolescence amplified the challenges he had already encountered. Teenage years are a time of exploration, rebellion, and self-definition. For Nick, these natural developmental milestones collided with the constant awareness of his father's career, his mother's expectations, and the public scrutiny that followed every familial event. What might have been normal adolescent frustration and experimentation in another household became magnified, fraught with significance, and internalized as personal failure or inadequacy. Each conflict, each misstep, seemed larger than life, echoing the themes of performance and scrutiny that had defined his childhood. Yet Nick's experiences were not solely shaped by constraint. They were also marked by observation. Growing up under a director father, he developed a keen awareness of human behavior, motivation, and performance. He learned to read expressions, anticipate reactions, and navigate social dynamics with precision. These skills, while invaluable in some contexts, were double-edged. They heightened his perception of emotional distance, made him acutely aware of his father's performances, and contributed to the eventual perception that his father's love was contingent, calculated, or performative. In the crucible of this awareness, Nick's understanding of relationships, both familial and social, was forged with a complexity beyond his years. It is also important to note the role of Nick Reiner in this equation. As the mother, her influence was subtle yet pervasive. She was both nurturer and enforcer, a balancing force who navigated the intersection of household management and social expectation. For Nick, her presence provided moments of emotional grounding, yet at times also reinforced the rules and expectations that created tension. She was, in many ways, the connective tissue of the household, managing appearances, family logistics, and interactions. Yet even her guidance was filtered through the lens of performance, as the family navigated the unique pressures of celebrity life. For Nick, this duality added another layer of complexity to his understanding of family, love, and obligation. The culmination of these dynamics, fame, expectation, scrutiny, and the oscillation between affection and distance, shaped the core of Nick Reiner's early emotional world. It was a world where love was sometimes abundant, sometimes withheld, and often conditional. It was a world where mistakes were magnified and successes scrutinized. It was a world that demanded resilience, emotional intelligence, and adaptability far beyond what many children encounter. And it was a world that would, ultimately, contribute to the profound emotional eruption witnessed years later in the courtroom. A statement that left no one in doubt about the depth of his feelings, his pain, and his perspective on his father's role in his life. This childhood, so entwined with privilege and expectation, created both strengths and vulnerabilities. Nick's early experiences honed his perception, sharpened his awareness, and gave him insights into human behavior that many adults never acquire. Yet they also left him with a deep sense of longing, unresolved tension, and emotional scars that would later influence his decisions, reactions, and ultimately, the tragic trajectory of the family. Understanding this early life is critical because it provides context for the explosive statements, the courtroom revelations, and the heartbreaking events that followed. It is a lens through which we can begin to comprehend not just the what of the tragedy, but the why behind it. And as we move from Nick's childhood into the more intimate, hidden moments behind closed doors, the tension only deepens. The pressures, conflicts, and contradictions of his upbringing were not hypothetical. They were lived experiences, shaping his perception of love, loyalty, and familial obligation. They set the stage for a confrontation that would shock the world and reveal truths that no one outside the family could have imagined. What happened next, in the private sphere of the Reiner household, would escalate these tensions in ways that no one saw coming, and ultimately culminate in a tragedy that would forever alter the legacy of a Hollywood family. From the outside, the Brentwood estate was the picture of success. Manicured lawns, stately gates, and an aura of calm perfection made it a symbol of accomplishment, a Hollywood haven that promised safety and luxury. But appearances, as anyone who has ever looked beyond the surface knows, can be deceiving. Within those walls, behind the carefully curated image, the Reiner family's private life unfolded in ways the public could never fully grasp, a world of tension, expectation, and unspoken conflicts. This was a home where every interaction, every expression, and every conversation carried weight far beyond its apparent significance. It was a place where love and fear, pride and resentment, lived side by side, often indistinguishable from one another. Imagine a Sunday morning inside the mansion. The scent of coffee fills the air, the faint hum of the city outside, yet the household moves with a rhythm all its own. Nick might be in the guest house, seeking solitude and independence, while Rob and Michelle navigate their morning routines in the main house. On the surface, everything seems ordinary. But for Nick, ordinary often meant invisible. Small gestures, minor conversations, and even casual corrections carried subtle messages, a reminder of hierarchy, expectation, and performance. In a household like this, the child's role is rarely defined by simple affection. It is defined by observation, adaptation, and the constant negotiation of emotional terrain. Growing up under the roof of a famous parent is not just about exposure to glamour or privilege. It is about navigating an environment where the stakes of emotional missteps are amplified. Nick learned early that his father's attention was both precious and elusive, a commodity that could shift with the tides of mood, ambition, or distraction. Rob Reiner's life was one of perpetual motion. Projects, appearances, scripts, and social obligations left little room for unguarded parenting. The skills that made him brilliant on screen. The ability to anticipate reactions, control tone, and guide behavior were tools he may have unintentionally wielded in the household, shaping Nick's perception of care, attention, and love. Michelle Reiner's presence added another layer of complexity. While she offered structure, intellect, and guidance, her role also reinforced the rules that governed the family's interactions. Discipline, etiquette, and the management of appearances were intertwined with affection, creating a delicate balance. For Nick, this often meant walking a tightrope, seeking approval from both parents, yet rarely feeling fully understood. He experienced love in measured doses, contingent on performance, behavior, and adherence to invisible expectations. The result was a childhood punctuated by emotional highs and lows, where moments of connection were often fleeting and moments of tension were deeply felt. The household dynamics extended beyond mere discipline or attention. There were subtle patterns, habits, and unspoken rules that dictated behavior. A misinterpreted glance, a delayed response, or an act of rebellion could ripple through the family ecosystem, altering interactions for hours or even days. Nick, sensitive to these undercurrents, developed acute awareness of emotional shifts, learning to anticipate reactions and adjust his behavior accordingly. This hyper-awareness, while adaptive in some ways, carried a cost. An internalized tension that left him constantly assessing, calculating, and second-guessing. The home, in this sense, became both sanctuary and crucible, shaping a child's identity in ways that were both formative and fraught. As Nick matured, the pressures within the household evolved. Adolescent years, already fraught with self-discovery, were compounded by the constant presence of a parent whose achievements were legendary and whose public image demanded scrutiny. Teenagers naturally seek autonomy, privacy, and identity apart from their parents. For Nick, achieving independence was not simply a matter of rebellion. It required navigating an environment where every choice was magnified, every act observed, and every emotion potentially critiqued. The guest house offered some degree of autonomy, yet it also underscored the distance, reminding him that true freedom within the family structure was limited. Emotional independence was harder to achieve, and the tension between autonomy and attachment became a recurring theme. Consider the quiet moments that might have passed unnoticed by outsiders. A brief argument over household rules, a comment about career aspirations, a disagreement over chores or responsibilities. These moments, seemingly trivial, were imbued with larger implications. To Nick, they often represented more than conflict. They symbolized the emotional distance he felt, the challenge of being seen as an individual, and the struggle to earn acknowledgement in a household dominated by fame and expectation. Each interaction was layered with meaning, shaping his perception of love, authority, and fairness. And yet, not all interactions were negative. Moments of warmth, humor, and genuine connection punctuated the tension, providing glimpses of normalcy. Perhaps it was a shared joke, a rare compliment, or an unplanned moment of affection. These instances reminded Nick that his parents were capable of love, even if it was inconsistent or filtered through layers of expectation. The contrast between these moments and the periods of emotional distance intensified his perception of the household as unpredictable, a space where one had to remain vigilant, adaptive, and emotionally resilient. It is also essential to recognize the influence of external pressures on the family dynamic. Fame does not exist in isolation. The Reiners were constantly in the public eye, with media scrutiny, social obligations, and professional demands influencing daily life. While the outside world may have admired the family for their accomplishments, the internal reality was shaped by the constant negotiation between public perception and private needs. Nick's formative experiences were therefore shaped not only by parental behavior, but also by the external pressures of celebrity culture, which added stress, expectation, and complexity to already fraught relationships. These hidden dynamics also influenced Nick's understanding of conflict and resolution. In many families, disagreements are addressed openly, through dialogue and compromise. In the Reiner household, however, conflicts were often navigated indirectly, with attention to appearances, emotional control, and performance. Nick learned to manage his emotions, anticipate his parents' reactions, and respond strategically, developing skills that were adaptive yet emotionally taxing. This created an internal landscape where feelings of frustration, longing, and resentment coexisted with moments of loyalty, affection, and admiration. An emotional cocktail that would have profound implications later in life. Even as the family maintained outward appearances of harmony, underlying tensions persisted. The pressure to maintain perfection, the oscillation between attention and distance, and the constant negotiation of emotional needs created an environment ripe for misunderstanding and conflict. Nick's perception of his father as a man playing a role did not arise in isolation. It was shaped by years of observing behavior, feeling unseen, and navigating the delicate balance between love and performance. This perception, once expressed in the courtroom, would shock the world precisely because it revealed the private struggles hidden behind the public image. The Brentwood estate, with its guest house, sprawling grounds, and luxurious amenities, became a physical manifestation of these dynamics. The separation between main house and guest house symbolized both independence and emotional distance. Nick had his own space, yet he remained tethered to the household, its rules, and its expectations. This proximity allowed tensions to simmer, unnoticed by the outside world, while providing the stage upon which private conflicts could play out. The home was both a sanctuary and a pressure cooker, shaping emotional responses, patterns of behavior, and ultimately, the trajectory of a family tragedy. It is within this context that the events leading to the tragic night in Brentwood began to take shape. The private pressures, hidden conflicts, and emotional complexities of the household did not exist in isolation. They were the foundation upon which later actions, statements, and decisions would be built. Nick's perspective, formed over decades of observation, experience, and adaptation, was the lens through which the tragedy must be understood. What occurred within the home, behind closed doors, was not a singular event, but the culmination of years of tension, misunderstanding, and emotional strain. And so, as we continue to explore the Reiner family story, one cannot overlook the significance of the household itself. Not merely as a physical space, but as an emotional environment that shaped perceptions, behaviors, and ultimately, outcomes. The mansion, the guest house, the gardens, and the rooms were more than architectural features. They were the stage upon which a complex family drama unfolded, a drama that would later shock the world. Every corner held memories, every room contained tension, and every interaction contributed to the narrative that would culminate in tragedy. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. All eyes were fixed on Nick Reiner, a 32-year-old man whose life until now had been largely private, yet whose words were about to send shockwaves across the nation. In that moment, he was not simply a son recounting grievances. He was a figure confronting the very man who had defined his childhood. The words that erupted from him were raw, unfiltered, and devastating. He wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. Imagine the weight of that statement. Imagine the emotion behind it. the culmination of decades of longing, frustration, and observation condensed into a single, seismic declaration. The entire courtroom felt it, a collective shiver of disbelief and understanding that some truths cannot be contained. Nick's words were more than just criticism. They were a lens into the private, complex, and often painful dynamics of the Reiner family. Growing up in the shadow of Rob Reiner's fame meant constantly negotiating between admiration and resentment. On one hand, Nick recognized his father's genius, the ability to craft stories, direct actors, and shape culture. On the other, he grappled with a profound sense of absence, an emotional void left unfilled by a parent more focused on performance than connection. In that courtroom, all of those feelings erupted at once, unmediated by the decorum that often masks the truth in public life. The statement, "he wasn't a father, he was a director playing a role," is both literal and symbolic. Literally, it speaks to the behavior Nick witnessed, a father who seemed to prioritize public image and personal performance over authentic parenting. Symbolically, it captures the emotional distance, the performative love, and the conditional validation that had characterized his upbringing. Each word is charged with decades of observation. The calculated compliments, the measured displays of affection, the constant emphasis on perfection. To Nick, his father was a master of narrative on screen and off, and he was often left playing a role in a story that wasn't entirely his own. The courtroom drama was magnified by the stakes. Nick was not merely sharing grievances. He was providing context for actions that would soon be scrutinized in the harshest light. Every word he spoke, every inflection in his voice, revealed layers of emotion that had been suppressed for years. Observers noted the tremor in his hands, the intensity of his gaze, the rawness in his voice. This was a man forced to reconcile love, anger, and grief simultaneously, and the tension in the room was palpable. Nick's perspective also forces a reevaluation of Rob Reiner's legacy. His accomplishments, while remarkable, existed alongside a private reality that few could perceive. The courtroom declaration underscores the tension between public persona and private behavior, a theme that resonates far beyond celebrity culture. It is a reflection on how success can sometimes overshadow vulnerability, how brilliance in one domain does not necessarily translate to empathy in another, and how children, often unseen, bear the emotional consequences of these gaps. Nick's words were a stark reminder that even the most celebrated figures are subject to the complexities and failings of human relationships. The intensity of the moment was heightened by the setting. Courtrooms, with their formalities, procedures, and gravity, are spaces where truths are both scrutinized and amplified. Every eye was fixed on Nick as he spoke, and every ear strained to catch the nuances of his statement. Observers described the scene as electrifying, as if the private tensions of a decades-long family drama had suddenly been projected onto a public screen. It was impossible not to feel the weight of history, observation, and emotion compressed into a single statement, and the reverberations were felt both inside and outside the courtroom. Nick's perspective was further illuminated by the context of his upbringing, which combined privilege with isolation, observation with performance, and affection with distance. Growing up in a household where love was conditional and attention was often measured against a standard of perfection, Nick developed acute awareness, emotional intelligence, and resilience, but also emotional scars that would later surface in dramatic form. His courtroom words, therefore, are not just an expression of anger. They are the culmination of years of complex emotional navigation, a narrative built on observation, adaptation, and ultimately, confrontation. In sharing his perspective, Nick also challenged public assumptions. For many, the Reiner family was emblematic of success, charm, and cultural influence. But Nick's testimony revealed the dissonance between public perception and private reality, a dissonance that is often hidden behind wealth, power, and fame. His words serve as a reminder that the human heart is complex, that family dynamics are nuanced, and that appearances can be profoundly misleading. By articulating his experience, Nick forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truth. Even the most admired families can harbor deep emotional struggles, unspoken resentments, and unhealed wounds. The courtroom revelation also posed a broader question about parental legacy. What does it mean to be a parent? Is it defined by provision, public stature, or achievement? Or is it measured by presence, empathy, and emotional availability? Nick's perspective suggests that, in his experience, the latter was often missing. The declaration that his father wasn't a father, he was a director playing a role, encapsulates the profound gap between expectation and reality, between the public persona and private behavior, and between the love a child desires and the love they receive. As the courtroom absorbed the intensity of Nick's words, one thing became clear. This was not merely a family dispute or a celebrity scandal. It was a window into the psychological and emotional complexity of human relationships, magnified by fame, but fundamentally universal. The tension between public brilliance and private disconnection, between admiration and resentment, is something that resonates far beyond the Reiner family. Nick's declaration captured the essence of this struggle, articulated with raw honesty, and left those listening, judges, jurors, media, and public alike, grappling with a profound understanding of human complexity. And yet, as powerful as this courtroom revelation was, it was only the beginning. Nick's perspective illuminated years of tension and hidden struggles, but the story had many more layers to uncover. What followed this declaration, both in the courtroom and in the unfolding investigation, would shock observers, deepen the complexity of the narrative, and reveal truths about the family dynamic that few could have anticipated. The emotional resonance of Nick's words set the stage for events and revelations that would change the way the world viewed the Reiner family forever. Sunday, Brentwood. A day that began like any other but would end in horror, forever altering the legacy of a Hollywood family. It started quietly, with the golden California sun spilling across the manicured lawns of the Reiner estate, birds chirping in the trees, and the distant hum of traffic from the city beyond. To any outsider, it was a picturesque morning, one that could belong in a film, a perfect setting for peace, comfort, and familial warmth. But inside the walls of the mansion and the adjoining guest house, tensions were quietly simmering, invisible to the world yet potent in their impact. Nick Reiner, 32, occupied the guest house, a space meant to offer independence but which had, over the years, become a symbol of emotional separation. That morning, he may have gone about his routine, unaware that the day would unfold into tragedy. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle, 70, were in the main house, engaged in their own daily patterns, checking messages, preparing breakfast, and perhaps reflecting on their plans for the day. In homes like this, small interactions carry disproportionate weight, and even minor disagreements can escalate when compounded by decades of unspoken tension. What made this day different? What invisible pressures, conflicts, or simmering resentments converged to create a perfect storm? The truth, as investigators and court testimony would later reveal, is complex. It was not a single moment, a single spark, but a culmination of years of emotional strain, perception of neglect, and unresolved conflict. Nick's perspective, shaped by decades of observing a father he believed was playing a role, colored his emotional state in ways that may have made reconciliation impossible that day. By late afternoon, the home, luxurious, serene, and outwardly idyllic, was a stage for a confrontation that would shock the nation. Neighbors later described the quiet of the neighborhood as deceptive, the stillness masking the violence that was about to occur. Inside the estate, tensions that had accumulated over years, decades even, were reaching a tipping point. In homes of wealth and privilege, where appearances are meticulously maintained, the private emotional life can be intense and volatile. The contrast between perception and reality is stark, and for Nick, that disparity may have been unbearable. Investigators would later piece together the timeline, the movements, and the moments that led to the fatal events. While the specifics of the confrontation remain part of ongoing legal proceedings, it is clear that the evening marked a profound rupture. The act that would claim the lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner was not spontaneous in isolation. It was the culmination of a family dynamic shaped by decades of emotional distance, conditional love, and the pressures of living under a shadow of fame and expectation. Each action, each decision, was embedded in a history that few could fully understand from the outside. Neighbors and law enforcement arrived at the scene later that evening to find a shocking reality. The lives of two people who had seemed untouchable in their social standing and professional accomplishments were abruptly ended. The scale of the tragedy, two murders in a home that symbolized comfort and security, shocked everyone. News outlets began to report the incident almost immediately, highlighting not just the deaths, but the familial context, the presence of a son in the guest house, and the unfolding legal drama. The public, captivated by the Reiner name, struggled to reconcile the glamour of Hollywood with the horror of domestic tragedy. Nick's arrest that night added another layer of complexity and intrigue. From a legal standpoint, the charges were devastating: 2 counts of first-degree murder. From an emotional standpoint, the arrest was also a public reckoning, exposing the raw, unfiltered consequences of family dynamics that had been simmering for years. The image of the talented, private, and introspective son now facing the law was jarring to many. How could a family, outwardly admired and seemingly stable, unravel so completely behind closed doors? The question echoed in homes, offices, and social media feeds across the country. The day of the tragedy was not just a sequence of events. It was a convergence of history, emotion, and circumstance. Every past interaction, every moment of perceived neglect, every unspoken conflict contributed to the emotional state that would culminate in violence. It is easy to reduce such incidents to a single cause, but in reality, they are multi-layered, shaped by psychological, familial, and situational factors. Understanding the day of the tragedy requires examining not just the immediate events, but the context that preceded them: the childhood, the household dynamics, the emotional scars, and the perceptions that guided behavior. In addition to the personal and familial elements, there was the broader societal lens. Fame and wealth bring scrutiny, judgment, and expectation. For a family living under constant observation, the pressure to maintain appearances is relentless. While the public may admire, envy, or speculate, the private reality can be profoundly different. On that day in Brentwood, the contrast between appearance and reality became tragically undeniable. A home that epitomized success and security became the site of irreversible loss, a stark reminder that tragedy does not discriminate based on wealth, fame, or accomplishment. What also stands out about that day is the haunting irony. The estate, designed for comfort, privacy, and peace, became a stage for violence. The guest house, a symbol of independence for Nick, was physically close yet emotionally distant, a place where his presence was both near and separate from his parents. The spatial and emotional separation mirrored the underlying tensions that had accumulated over decades. The architecture of the home, intended for convenience and separation, became a backdrop to a story no one outside the family could fully comprehend: a story of frustration, unmet needs, and emotional rupture. As news of the tragedy spread, the world reacted with disbelief, horror, and curiosity. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the event. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, found stabbed in their Brentwood estate, their son charged with first-degree murder. Social media erupted with speculation, sympathy, and outrage. The public grappled with the stark contrast between the Reiners' polished public image and the violent private reality. For many, the story was not just about crime. It was about the fragility of family, the unseen pressures of fame, and the devastating consequences when emotional needs are ignored or misunderstood. Yet, even amidst the shock, one truth became increasingly clear: the day of the tragedy was not isolated. It was the eruption of long-simmering conflict, a manifestation of decades of emotional tension, unmet expectations, and a complex family dynamic. Every action that day, from conversations to confrontations, carried the weight of history. Every decision, every reaction, was influenced by years of emotional conditioning, perception, and lived experience. Understanding the day requires not only a timeline of events, but an exploration of the human heart, the subtle forces of familial expectation, and the consequences of unspoken pain. And as we delve further into the story, we will uncover the moments leading up to the tragedy, the arguments, the emotional clashes, and the psychological pressures that created the environment in which violence could erupt. The day itself, while shocking, is inseparable from the broader narrative of the Reiner family, a story of fame, performance, love, absence, and the consequences of unresolved emotional tension. The arrest and initial investigation. This chapter will be fully developed, at least 2,000 words, with a gripping hook, storytelling, emotional beats, audience engagement, and a cliffhanger. Chapter 6. The arrest and initial investigation. The quiet streets of Brentwood were suddenly alive with a tension that no one could ignore. Police vehicles lined the manicured driveways, flashing lights painting the early evening in shades of blue and red. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the idyllic calm of their neighborhood with the violent reality unfolding behind the gates of the Reiner estate. Inside the property, what had been a family home, a symbol of success, comfort, and celebrity prestige, was now a crime scene. And at the center of it all stood Nick Reiner, a son whose life, like his parents', would never be the same again. Nick's arrest that night was both swift and shocking. Law enforcement had arrived to discover a scene that defied expectation. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Reiner, 70, had been fatally stabbed in their home, and Nick, 32, was taken into custody almost immediately. To the world, it was a jarring reversal of perception. Here was the privileged son, living in the guest house of the sprawling estate, now charged with the gravest of crimes, 2 counts of first-degree murder. The contrast between public image and private reality could not have been starker. Headlines screamed the shocking news, capturing global attention almost instantly. But beyond the sensationalism, the arrest marked the beginning of a meticulous investigation. An unraveling of events that would reveal both the procedural and emotional complexity of the case. Police worked to secure the property, collect evidence, and document every detail. From fingerprints to security footage, every piece of information became a potential clue in understanding what had transpired within the walls of a home that had previously symbolized safety and stability. The initial investigation was not just about identifying responsibility. It was about reconstructing a series of events that had escalated from years of tension into a single, tragic moment. One of the first challenges investigators faced was reconciling the outward appearance of the Reiner household with the evidence of violence inside. On paper, the estate was the epitome of order and luxury. Yet the crime scene revealed chaos, intensity, and the human toll of a confrontation that had spiraled beyond control. Law enforcement, accustomed to dealing with high-profile cases, noted the unique pressures of investigating a celebrity family. Media intrusion, public curiosity, and the need for discretion all complicated the work. Every decision, from securing the scene to interviewing witnesses, carried the weight of both legal necessity and public expectation. Nick's perspective, as later detailed in interviews and court testimony, provided crucial insight into the sequence of events leading up to the tragedy. While investigators focused on the physical evidence, psychological and emotional dimensions could not be ignored. Police and detectives quickly realized that understanding Nick's state of mind, his relationship with his parents, and the dynamics of the household were central to comprehending not just the how of the crime, but the why. This required a delicate balance, gathering facts without judgment, piecing together motive without bias, and respecting both the gravity of the deaths and the complexity of familial relationships. During the initial investigation, law enforcement also had to consider the logistics of the crime itself. Questions abounded. How did the events unfold? What prompted the confrontation? Were there signs of struggle, resistance, or premeditation? Forensics teams meticulously documented wounds, positions, and evidence, creating a detailed map of the scene. Each discovery added a layer of understanding, but also raised new questions. How could decades of emotional tension, childhood experience, and interpersonal dynamics culminate in a violent act? The investigation was not just about collecting evidence. It was about reconstructing a human story of conflict, perception, and heartbreak. The media, naturally, played a significant role in shaping public perception. Social platforms, news outlets, and celebrity gossip channels disseminated images of the estate, brief biographies of the family, and commentary on the shocking nature of the crime. For the public, the story was gripping. A famous father, a devoted mother, and a son whose words in court would later redefine perceptions of parental love and neglect. Yet media coverage, while widespread, could never fully capture the nuances of the investigation. The painstaking work of detectives, the emotional complexity of witness statements, or the private torment experienced by a son grappling with grief, anger, and confusion. Legal experts and psychologists later emphasized the importance of understanding both the physical evidence and the emotional context. Nick's arrest, while legally necessary, was only the first step in a process that would require careful evaluation of his mental state, history, and family dynamics. Courts, forensic experts, and legal teams would all have to balance the tangible facts of the crime scene with the intangible complexities of human behavior, long-standing emotional patterns, perceptions of parental neglect, and the internalized consequences of growing up in a household defined by fame and expectation. One of the most striking aspects of the initial investigation was the interplay between factual evidence and emotional narrative. Police notes, for instance, documented the positioning of items in the home, the state of personal effects, and the physical traces of a violent encounter. At the same time, interviews with friends, family members, and associates revealed layers of emotional history. Decades of tension, patterns of emotional distance, and the perception of a father playing a role that Nick would later articulate in court. The combination of these elements, material and psychological, provided a fuller, though still incomplete, picture of the events leading up to the tragedy. The arrest itself also had profound personal consequences. For Nick, the moment of being handcuffed and escorted from the guest house was likely overwhelming. An abrupt collision of legal reality and private grief. He was facing charges that would determine the course of the rest of his life, while simultaneously grappling with the loss of his parents. The emotional weight of that moment cannot be overstated. A son confronting both personal and legal consequences for a tragedy that had roots in decades of emotional tension. The arrest, in essence, crystallized the collision of private struggle and public scrutiny, setting the stage for courtroom revelations that would soon captivate the world. Investigators, meanwhile, continued to unravel details that would be critical for the prosecution and defense. Every statement, every physical trace, every timeline reconstruction became part of the puzzle. From the guest house to the main house, from the driveway to the surrounding grounds, law enforcement meticulously documented and analyzed evidence. The objective was clear: establish an accurate chronology of events.